and a sort of chunk of other territory too, and ruling out NATO membership. We've touched on it a couple of times this week, but I think it sounds like from Donald Trump there could be some movement overnight on that. So we will bring you the latest, of course, tomorrow morning on breakfast. I mean, it's something, John, this meeting today, the one that was supposed to be chaired by David Lammy, that was supposed to have high-level American support, was meant to be a real moment. But obviously there's been a bit of a sort of downgrading of that particular meeting, but it still feels like this is a story that's going to rumble on. That and Rachel Reeves, who of course is over in America, desperately trying to broker some kind of deal to ease the pressure on car makers. We've had a lot of economic news around today, most of it not good for the Chancellor. But I think we're also got one eye on the potential for an agriculture deal. Some farmers, farming community in this country really deeply concerned about the potential for American products coming into the UK in any kind of trade situation. So I think we'll be bringing you the latest on that too.
Right, fascinating stuff. And it's going to be so interesting to see how the government just tries to strike that balance between doing a deal with America. Apparently Donald Trump, as you say, is keen to get some sort of movement on food and farming imports into this country, which you'd have thought, if we're going to do a deal with the European Union, is a direct contradiction. I mean, you can have one, but you can't have both. I mean, how do you square that thing? And we do have ministers saying they're not going to give ground on food standards in this country, which would seem to sort of shut the door on some of those American food imports. Will Donald Trump wear that? That's an interesting barrier. I wonder how they get through that. When it comes to the Ukraine story, though, Kate, I've got to say, from what I'm seeing and just hearing from all the conversations on Ukraine from the Ukrainian side and those who support Ukraine in Europe, look, they will not cede sovereignty over Crimea. It's against the constitution. It's against the will of the Ukrainian people. It seems to be one of the basic, as it were, American demands. I mean, how on earth do they deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's the question from here on out, is how do you square that circle? Clearly, it doesn't just have huge implications for Ukraine. It has huge implications, knock-on implications for international world order too, because it's not the only area of the world where one country is seeking maybe to control a territory that doesn't necessarily belong to it. And this could be seen as setting a precedent. If America pushes for Russia to essentially gain Crimea as its own territory through military means, then I think that will mean other nations are emboldened to potentially do the same, and that could spell some real problems in future. Absolutely huge stumbling block, and I don't think stumbling block does the problem justice. The show is going to be fascinating, Kate. Looking forward to that tomorrow. Pienaar and Friends coming up.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar and Friends, which tonight is the editor of ConservativeHome Giles Dilnot, and Mikey Smith back with us, the deputy political editor at the Mirror, and you, of course. Glad to have you here. As always, share your thoughts and we can chat after the news with Laura Cook.
Thank you. Good evening. President Zelensky after he appeared to reject a US ultimatum over the status of Crimea. In February, Trump publicly criticised the Ukrainian president in the White House, telling him he was not in a good position and was gambling with World War III. Catherine Philp is the Times World Affairs editor and explains it matters more that the deal is done well instead of being done quickly.
That's why you shouldn't be trying to do it all in one go, and that's not how peacemaking works. And if you look at, precedents even for conflicts that have never fully been solved, Bosnia and Kosovo have never entirely, yes, the violence stopped, but they've never been entirely solved in terms of all sides agreeing on the legal status of those territories. But nonetheless, those are processes that took years. And this is a process they're talking about trying to do within 100 days.
Earlier, the US Vice President repeated America's threat to walk away from Ukraine peace talks unless what he calls an explicit proposal is agreed. J.D. Vance warns both Ukraine and Russia will need to make concessions. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has announced plans to beef up Britain's defences against cheap imports, undercutting UK businesses amid the fallout from US President Donald Trump's tariffs. Rachel Reeves said she would review rules on low-value imports due to concerns they unfairly benefit foreign companies like Temu and Shein at the expense of British British high street stores. The Trade Remedies Authority will also put resources into helping businesses report unfair practices like dumping, in which gold goods are sold into the UK at below market prices. A paddleboarding company owner has been jailed for 10.5 years over the deaths of 4 people who drowned in a river in southwest Wales. They'd been on an organised tour when they become trapped under fast-moving water in Pembrokeshire in October 2021. A court heard Nerys Lloyd wasn't remotely qualified to lead the trip and put excitement over safety in hazardous conditions. Here's some of her first words with police at the scene.
So is it a group? Just
it's a group paddle. And they didn't go down the middle, so they went over the falls and they fell in. I was trying to get back to them, but I couldn't.
Yeah.
Reform UK's Anne Widdecombe has told Times Radio she's not teaming up with any losers after the leak of a recording of senior Conservative Robert Jenrick. Jenrick said he would bring a coalition together in order to end the electoral battle between Reform and the Tories. When asked if she would team up with Jenrick, Ms Widdecombe was clear.
Absolutely not. I'm not teaming up with any losers. Reform is winning. Reform is at the top of the polls. We're fielding the most candidates in the local elections. We are winning. Why on earth we would want to join up with a bunch of people who squandered an 80-seat majority into an opposition landslide, I don't know.
Talks to resolve the long-running bin strike in Birmingham will involve conciliation service ACAS next week. It follows a meeting today between union officials and the city's council, which ended without agreement. Rubbish has been piling up on the streets for more than 6 weeks during the walkout over pay. Oni Kassab from Unite says it's frustrating.
For the other group of workers affected, the loaders, we are within touching distance of getting to an agreement. The council need to be able to come back to us and give us assurances that our driver members will not be facing a cut in pay. The council leader has said that nobody's pay will be cut. Well, let's see that in these negotiations.
Birmingham City Council says negotiations are ongoing and positive. And for a roundup of news on demand, subscribe to the Times News Briefing podcast.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
Pienaar Friends on Times Radio with NatWest Cushion.
It's good to have you with us here on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in very good company. Here we are again on your radio live. We're live too on the Times Radio YouTube channel, so you can see what we're doing as well as have a listen to what we're doing. And if you've been listening in the car, say, and you're just going through the door, don't have to miss a second. You can go to your smart speaker. You can got an Amazon, Google, or Apple device. Just ask it to play Times Radio, and there we will be for you. Our friends this evening, Mikey Smith, back with us, Deputy Political Editor at the Mirror. Hello to you, Mikey.
Hello.
And for the first time, we're joined by Giles Dilnot, Editor at ConservativeHome. Great to see you, Giles.
Good to be here.
Now, Giles, I'll come to you first in honour of your debut appearance. What's your thought for the day?
My thought for the day is that it is an underrated skill in politics to say sorry sometimes. Now, the Conservatives have been forced to do that quite recently, and in a recent survey of Conservative Home members, over half of them said, well, we haven't said sorry enough, which is something for Kemi Badenoch to take on board. But looking at PMQs today, it would have been so much easier, and I don't really understand the comms of the Labour government at the moment, if they'd just gone, it's great. I mean, the official line from everybody is we welcome this Supreme Court decision and it gives clarity. Well, it does do that, but it might have been wise to just go, and, you know, it solves a few things for us. We may have got some of this wrong. And it's just an underrated thing in politics, actually saying sorry, or, you know, you've had your mind changed, or things have been clarified for you and therefore things are slightly different, is less dangerous than I think some politicians think.
Yes. You're smiling, Mikey.
I wonder if apologies are normally better taken if they're honestly felt, is all I would say.
So you think that Keir Starmer wasn't honestly feeling it?
I don't think he honestly feels that he necessarily has to apologise for anything. I think he's always had a fairly nuanced approach to trans issues.
Nuanced is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that.
I don't know. I've talked to the guy about it, and he's never come down heavily on one side or the other. Not because he doesn't want to annoy anyone. I genuinely don't think he wants to. He does it for fear of upsetting people. Yeah. I think he genuinely does it because he knows there's potential harm on both sides if he goes heavily one way or another, and to apologise to one side because the court has come down on the on their side.
Take that a bit further for me, because your description of Keir Starmer's thinking there encompassed fearfulness and confusion and timidity and just being wrong. How would you define it? Because you told me you talked about it.
I would say it was he's often, his approach to solving problems is more nuanced than
nuance won't do again.
Than the political system that we have really allows for.
Yeah.
He knows that there are strongly held feelings on both sides, and it's not that I think he genuinely thinks there is a way of solving this issue that doesn't involve both sides feeling like they've been trampled on. And I think him at this point, and again, it's been a while since I've talked to him about it, but I suspect at this point he's trying to acknowledge what has happened and what has been agreed, without making trans people feel like they've been trampled on.
I see the point about the political system, but I raise you Blair's first big problem as Prime Minister. I was not in the same field, was the F1 thing with Bernie Ecclestone. And what did he do? He went straight on the television and went, I'm a reasonable guy, I got this wrong. And people gave it, they went, yeah, okay, that sounds reasonable to us.
But it sounds like Mikey isn't saying that that's what he thinks, that his position has been maybe a bit ambivalent, that maybe what's been driving it, tell me if I'm wrong, because I want to hear what you think. Are we talking about Keir Starmer, who feels that his thinking on this and his articulation of what he was thinking was driven by a desire to be kind, by wanting to be tolerant? But the trouble with it all is this is a subject where you cannot avoid offending someone. There are people, it is such a polarising argument. If you have a position, you're going to upset someone. And if you're a leader of a political party, you can't completely get away from that.
I think he thinks that it is, rather than being a polarising argument, I think he thinks it is an argument that has become polarised, and I think there is a distinction there.
I mean, blown out of proportion?
Not blown out of proportion, but I think, and I don't think I'll get much argument that there have been some actors on both sides of this debate that have been arguing in very bad faith, and have not been trying to come to a kind conclusion in any way. And I think that has taken hold. It's caused enormous damage to both sides of the argument. And I think possibly it was wishful thinking to hope that he could come up with some kind solution for everyone.
So far what we've heard, I think, from Keir Starmer has been an exercise in really trying to avoid a direct answer to the question. If you were being helpful, as I'm sure you would wish to be, what would you draft for the Prime Minister to say when he's asked for his position now in the light of the Supreme Court ruling?
I think I would probably draft something fairly woolly along the lines of, look, we agree on so much more than we disagree on. There are tiny, tiny points of inflection along this where we can work it out on a case-by-case basis. We don't have to make this a big, polarising, one wins, the other one loses, because there are huge amounts of people on each side who, whichever side ended up quote-unquote winning, would find themselves quite badly hurt by that.
Can I help, Mikey?
Please.
I can help you on this one.
The editor of ConservativeHome, what help would you give to the Prime Minister?
No, the thing is, so I have somebody in my family who is trans, and we have perfectly reasonable discussions about it. My suggestion, probably to the Prime Minister, and this is where I think things got really difficult, is the broad swathe of the population probably fairly accepting. What they didn't like was the idea that I must accept something I know is biologically a fact. Right? I think the pushing on biological sex was a mistake on the grounds it's like saying gravity doesn't exist. You can't. Robert Winston did this on the BBC. He made it very, very clear. You can't change chromosomal sex. That doesn't mean you can't have an accommodation with part of society and let people live and let live. And my discussions with that family member always are so lacking in the attack and let's work this out. It's just like, I sometimes want to say, why can't the discussion be like this anyway? Yeah. And it's got like that because you're asked to pick a side.
Yeah. For a lot of people, that's true. This was about common sense, which doesn't mean that a lot of people want to have a verbal punch-up, because most people just didn't.
Yeah.
But Keir Starmer still left himself kind of exposed on so many fronts.
I don't know. I think he feels, like Giles says, like most of the country do, that to most of the country this argument does not matter. It doesn't take up any of their brain space at all. I think, yes, some of the extremes of the argument have caused the problem.
Being forced to accept something that is a scientific fact, I think people troubled there, and if that had stopped there, there might have been a bit more, less heat in the argument.
At the same time, from the other side, and we talked about this a little bit last week, the repeated questions, what is a woman, demanding people come up with a very
well, the court did.
It did, but who does that help? What possible? When we've got to this point, wouldn't it be
schools, hospitals?
All right. I think we got a fair distillation of your positions on
Also,
this.
we haven't had his thought.
Right? No, well, it's your turn. Your thought for the
My
day.
thought for the day. And forgive me if you've talked about it, because I think this happened yesterday, and it's just the first chance I've had to talk to anyone about this, and I'm very, very excited about the return to frontline politics of Steve Hilton, your friend and mine. So Steve Hilton, for those who don't know, used to be David Cameron's blue sky ideas man. He used to come up with crazy ideas like, removing all consumer rights because it would help the economy, and I think he wanted to ban maternity leave at one point. And if you've seen the thick of it, the character of Stuart is pretty soundly based on Steve Hilton. And he announced he moved to California after he left Number 10.
Yes.
And started a bafflingly popular Fox News TV show, which he has held ever since. And now he has decided and announced that he's running for governor of California, which, I mean, I could always live with more Steve Hilton in my life. I think he's hilarious. I think it's doubly hilarious how popular he has become in America. It's just so unlikely.
Well, but you do concede there's popularity there.
There is.
He's running for the state of California, will run for the governorship of California as a Republican. In a deep, deep blue Democrat state. But if he pulled this off, he wouldn't be the first Republican governor of California. He'd be treading in some pretty big footsteps.
Yeah. I think he'll do all right. I mean, it's just a gut feeling, but I think if he gets the nomination, he'll probably do all right.
Yeah, because
he's quite popular among the MAGA end of the Republican Party. I don't think he's offensive to the moderate Republicans. He, has some wild and crazy ideas. Tell you what, one of my first jobs reporting on politics, I worked for a shaky little blog which is no longer there anymore, but I made the Steve Hilton policy generator, where you could click a button to imagineer a narrative. And it would come up with things like, let's download rice.
So I know. Do you remember briefly on Twitter there was a fake Steve Hilton?
There was yes.
And I spoke to the person who once showed Steve Hilton the fake Steve Hilton account. And they said to me, and I've always remembered this phrase, he laughed like a man who knew that he ought to find it funny and really didn't. And I actually upped the amount, because when he was working for David Cameron, he would really hide away. I mean, he wore T-shirts and shorts famously and not suits. And I was once doing something outside Downing Street to camera, and the cameraman just physically pushed me out of the way and was like, I don't know what's going on here. And I looked over my shoulder, and Steve Hilton was walking into Downing Street in a T-shirt, blue T-shirt. And I think we upped the amount of footage we had of Steve Hilton by about 25%, because he used to hide away. And by the way, he looks very different these days. He's sleek and, he's getting himself match fit.
We're talking about California here. A certain sort of hue of golden brown is absolutely required. But you look at some of the boots he would be walking. We're talking about, in the past, Ronald Reagan, we're talking about Arnie Schwarzenegger. Has he got that kind of star appeal? I mean, what do you think? He's got friends on the right wing in America.
I think if he didn't have, I mean, he's not Arnie, but I think if he didn't have that kind of star appeal, he wouldn't have been able to hold down a relatively prime-time Fox show for this many years. It's been on the air for nearly a decade now, I think.
Yeah.
But
meanwhile, the former vice president of the United States and failed presidential candidate Kamala Harris is wrestling with the idea of whether to go for the same job, isn't she?
That would be very interesting, and I would imagine that's scaring a number of Democrat strategists.
Yes, I imagine many people are advising her against that decision.
I think we can hear a little bit of Steve Hilton's building up for that big run in the great state of California.
I proudly accept your nomination for governor of the great, the magnificent, the beautiful, but so disastrously run state of California. Now, I'm not an expert in the ocean, but I do feel that the tide is turning in California. We're going to make that California revolution happen.
Well, there you have it. Friend of the show, Steve.
Was he saying that he's not an expert in the ocean or on the ocean?
I'm not an oceanographer, but I'm a big shark.
He has a way with words.
It's a strange delivery.
All right, one to watch. We're going to talk about one of the really, really big stories today in just a minute, guys. Of course, the talks in London on Ukraine, the search for a ceasefire, which seems to have got, as far as we can tell, nowhere, which, that being the case, I think will come as a surprise to precisely no one anywhere. What is going on there? I mean, what do we make of it? How concerned should we be about that? This is Pienaar Friends with Giles Dilnot and Mikey Smith, and we're here in association with NatWest Cushion, making workplace pensions and savings easy. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
Pienaar Friends on Times Radio with NatWest Cushion, making workplace pensions and savings easy. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
And we're going to be talking after the news about the standoff on a Ukraine ceasefire. We're going to be talking to our valued US colleague at the Wall Street Journal, Molly Ball. But just briefly, guys, your thoughts on what's been going on or not going on in London. We don't know what happened behind closed doors. We know there's no sign of any kind of ceasefire. Don't need a microscope to discern that. And we also see that that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Steve Witkoff, the President's friend and envoy, they didn't turn up. Word is, in some American reporting, they were just angry that Ukraine wasn't giving more ground. Now, look, maybe no surprise that Ukraine wasn't giving more ground, but maybe worried that America was angry about that. Because when America gets angry on this subject, things happen.
I think one of the things that's going on at the moment is an underestimation of just how much the Ukrainians are not prepared to budge on concessions to Putin, particularly land concessions. Crimea, I think, has been discussed as a bargaining chip for a long time, but this is involving Donetsk and everything, and that's not a 3-year war, that's a 14-year war. I think he's underestimated the fact that Zelensky will still be popular if he stands firm. The problem he's got is he can't continue this fight without American support, particularly intelligence support and materiel. He wants this because he said he was going to deliver it. I think he's finding on both sides, and he seems reluctant to admit that Putin isn't playing ball either.
Yeah, which is to many people less than surprising. What maybe is surprising is that a team of politicians, with anyone with a rudimentary grasp of politics and how it plays in other parts of the world, or for that matter, universal truths, will know that if you're asking a country to cede sovereignty of an area that was taken by force, they're not going to like that idea. And if it's enshrined in the constitution of that country, they can't do that. And when you've got the population of the country never likely to agree to that, how can you expect them to do that? And yet, the White House team seems to want exactly that, Mikey.
And it goes beyond just the feeling of people within Ukraine. It goes all the way across Europe. International law. You don't negotiate to cede control of territory that's been taken by force. And there's no modern equivalent of this happening. There's nothing really to compare it against. I think Giles was right. I think it's been an underestimation. I wouldn't be surprised if America did just walk away at this point. I think the threats of just walking away are real.
When you say walk away, I mean walk away from the talks, but also walk away from supporting Ukraine in any form.
Yeah.
So I put that point and that fear to former advisor to President Zelensky earlier on the show this afternoon. He thought, look, who knows, anything's possible, but that would alienate America very significantly from a huge part of the free world, because it would effectively make America an ally of Russia, not just sort of uncomfortably close to the Kremlin, but an actual ally, especially when we got Washington talking about doing business with Russia at the same time.
Just a year ago, John, the line from our own Foreign Office, which is where I was working at the time for the then Foreign Secretary, and obviously we dealt with Ukraine, Russia pretty much all the time, was that Putin cannot be seen to gain from this because the world will become a more dangerous place. That if he gets something out of doing this thing that hadn't been done for 70 years, walking into a neighbouring country in Europe and starting a land war, and he definitely did start it, not Zelensky, that just could not happen. That would be a line we could not cross. I don't think in the chancelleries of Europe that view has changed very much.
But
what has
surely
changed
hard to
is
imagine.
America.
It's hard to imagine the White House doing that, though, isn't it?
I think it would be quite hard, because then, as you say, he's literally putting himself into the camp of Putin. And also, it doesn't play well with what he really wants to concentrate on, is China. And if that's possible in Ukraine, well, then why isn't Taiwan possible?
Yes.
I don't know. I put myself in the head of Donald Trump with great care and trepidation. But if I put myself in his head, I wonder how much domestically it would bother him to pull out of Ukraine. And I think it would probably be, among his supporters, a very popular idea. I don't think it would damage him politically among his non-supporters in any dreadful measure.
Okay. Well, we don't know how that's going to play out at this point. We can speculate, we can talk about it, we can be concerned and even worried and even alarmed about it, but we'll just have to see, because I think maybe we find out an answer to that question before too very long. Meanwhile, let's talk about British defence, because the government's thinking on the defence of this country as part of the defence of Europe against the threat from Russia and the East seems to be, I don't know, all over the place. That's not overstating it. There's been a fundamental review of Britain's defences. It's been going on for a good long while. It's been conducted by Lord Robertson, George Robertson, who was a former General Secretary General of NATO, and Fiona Hill, who was a former Washington advisor. Last we heard, I was talking to Robert Fox the other day. It's ready. It's there. It's written, but the Prime Minister does not want to let it out there. And the argument that was deployed was the Prime Minister is looking at a report that says we are so far away from having a workable fighting machine to defend this country, and the need and the cost and the effort required to put it right is so vast, the Prime Minister simply just doesn't want to face that argument now. Mikey, you keep your ear to the ground. Are you picking up anything of the same?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's quite as clear cut as that. The other thing I'm not sure about is at what point it was completed, because we were told it was completed quite a long time ago,
which might make it out of date.
Which might make it out of date as well. And if you were Keir Starmer looking at a document that is telling you all those things, we are nowhere near where we need to be, and that was written before there was a possibility that we had to send troops into Ukraine, then you might want to consider when you deploy that and how you deploy that. I know there are certain sort of urgent things I believe that they've sort of done already. There was I forget the details, but there was some details of some ships being retired and replaced that were in the defence review. So this is going back months, and those have already been done. So I wonder. I mean, they've said it's done and ready, and they're going to have to publish it at some point.
Can't just sit on it.
You can't just sit on it. But I wonder if it gets another draft before it's done.
I think it will, because the dissonance is huge. It's money. So to get to 2.7% of GDP from 2.5 is hard enough. You want to go to 3? That's really...
That's in the promises in the course of the next Parliament.
And Trump wants people to go to 5.
We're talking about percentage of national earnings.
I mean, it's absolutely... You would have to make some fundamental restructuring of the economy to achieve that. That means that, and as you say, next Parliament, that means for the next 3-4 years, you've got to talk tough and not have the instrumental backing to be able to make it real. It's a really tough decision. It's interesting that one of the other things, and we mentioned China just now, one of the reasons that Rishi Sunak was quite slow about getting his SDR out was because everybody said, how are you going to define China? How are you going to define China? That won't have gone away. And given the way this government has been talking with China, that's also awkward.
Yes.
If he comes out and says they're a state threat, well, he's going to undo quite a lot of work he's been doing so far.
It is. But that's almost simple compared to the job of building physical defences for Western Europe against Russia. And we're talking about what is clear about President Trump's intentions is he wants to disengage from the defence of Western Europe, whether or not it's within NATO or without NATO. John Bolton mentioned him earlier on. He's long had a suspicion that President Trump wants to disengage from NATO. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. We don't know. That's on the agenda now. But either way, he does want to pull back and leave it to the European allies to do a whole lot more than they've been doing so far. And he's got a point about that.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Europe has been riding on those coattails for far too long, to a point which actually, in retrospect, is really rather embarrassing. But correcting that, what a huge job that is.
Because they'd have to then start spending the money on defence that they've been spending on other things that make them popular and do well in various European countries, and remove all of that, because that's what they did, knowing, well, America would sort this out if it was... Now they're just not going to be there. I mean, even now, I think we can go, they're not as reliable as an ally as they used to be.
OK, we're going to move on, because we're going to hear from our friend and colleague stateside after the news. You're listening to Pienaar and Friends here on Times Radio. Time at 6:30, pretty much exactly, for the news with Laura Cook.
Across the UK, on DAB... This is Times Radio.
Thank you. Good evening. Donald Trump's accused Ukraine's leader of making inflammatory statements harmful to peace negotiations with Russia as Volodymyr Zelensky refused to legally recognise the occupation of Crimea. US Vice President J.D. Vance warned concessions would be needed on both sides and threatened to pull America out of talks. The White House insists a deal is close. The Chancellor has insisted on a visit to Washington that the White House is keen to do a trade deal with the UK.
We're not going to rush a deal. We want to get the right deal in our country's national interest. And that is what people can expect from this government.
Rachel Reeves says it could include a technology partnership building on close defence and security ties. Donald Trump's put high taxes on foreign goods arriving into the US. Britain's rate is 10%. A woman's been jailed over the deaths of 4 people who drowned during an organised paddleboarding trip in Pembrokeshire. Nerys Lloyd's accused of being unqualified to lead the tour and failed to get consent forms. Talks to resolve the long-running bin strike in Birmingham will involve conciliation service ACAS next week. It follows a meeting today between union officials and the city's council, which ended without agreement. Rubbish has been piling up in the streets for more than 6 weeks during the walkout over pay. And mourners have remarked on the stillness inside St Peter's Basilica, where Pope Francis is lying in state. The Vatican's considering extending hours for the public to file past his open coffin to bring down the 8-hour-long queues. And for a roundup of news on demand, you can subscribe to the Times News Briefing podcast.
This is Times Radio.
From Vance and Rubio, JD Vance, the Vice President, Marco from Vance and Rubio, JD Vance, the Vice President, Marco Rubio, and from Donald Trump on Truth Social today to see if they can move it along a bit. I mean, it is a bit like we've said this is going to happen, we're going to make this happen, and so it will happen. It's those shouty capital letters. And of course, there are, 2 other parties involved in this, Russia and Ukraine. The Times doing a great job, by the way, of setting out what Russia would have to agree to and what Ukraine would have to agree to. There's a great piece of analysis that'll be up there shortly if it's not already there on thetimes.com. Both those parties have got to agree. And when you look at what some of those conditions are, that Crimea would go to Russia, that Ukraine would have to concede Crimea and various other parts of their territory, which has been taken by Russia. They might get a bit of Kharkiv, they might get the Zaporizhia power plant. But, from what they've been saying, I doubt it would be acceptable to them. But we'll be talking that through on the show. We're also joined by the former leader of the Lib Dems, Vince Cable. We'll be talking about a US trade deal and the fact that the Lib Dems want that to go up in front of the House. To be signed off by them before anything is agreed. And we'll also talk a little bit tonight, John, about Gen Z having to be taught how to use phones. There's a great story that's being followed up by the Times for the T2 section tomorrow. It's about a careers advisor at Nottingham College who's teaching some young people to use the phone. She said they simply don't have the confidence to pick up the phone and start calling people. Phone anxiety, she's called it, something that they come across very regular. It's causing nausea and dizziness amongst the young. Whatever next.
I know. It is a strange world, a strange new world. And a fascinating show coming up at 7, Kate. Looking forward to that.
Cheers.
With you here on Times Radio. Now, let's all of us always a welcome guest on this programme. Molly Ball, who is a senior correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. On the line, Molly, hi.
Hi.
You're there in Washington, D.C., I assume, as always, at your post.
Indeed I am. Happy Wednesday.
Happy Wednesday to you, Molly. Look, I mean, we're talking about Ukraine and what's been going on in London today, here in London, which is, look, as far as we can see, not a huge amount. They were technical talks, that's how they were described, but none of the main players were there. We saw Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff pulling out ahead of the meeting, even happening. And here's the thing, Molly, there's been some reporting from your side of the Atlantic that had a lot to do with the Trump team in Washington being angry that Ukraine was not willing to give the kind of ground that they wanted Ukraine to give. Now, first of all, Molly, can you give us just your own take on that, on the thinking in Washington behind the scaling down of these talks in London?
I think that's that's accurate. I mean, you saw the president himself say on Truth Social today, express that frustration openly with President Zelensky, lambasting him, as he has done in the past, for not having the cards in Trump's words and for making demands that Trump views as unreasonable. He specifically called out the Zelensky's opposition to any kind of recognition of the Russian possession of Crimea. So it is clear that the administration is frustrated, specifically with the Ukraine side, despite, as you mentioned, many analysts believing that the deal that has been put on the table is more favorable than not to Russia.
Right. Now, you mentioned that Truth Social post that was published just a very short while ago, where the president set out his position in his own particular way. Let's have a listen to that Truth Social. It's been voiced by one of our colleagues here in London, so forgive us if he doesn't sound precisely like Donald Trump, but it went like this.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is boasting on the front page of the Wall Street Journal that Ukraine will not legally recognise the occupation of Crimea. There's nothing to talk about here. This statement is very harmful to the peace negotiations with Russia, in that Crimea was lost years ago under the auspices of President Barack Hussein Obama and is not even a point of discussion. Nobody is asking Zelensky to recognise Crimea as Russian territory, but if he wants Crimea, why didn't they fight for it 11 years ago when it was handed over to Russia without a shot being fired? The area also houses, for many years before the Obama handover, major Russian submarine bases. It's inflammatory statements like Zelensky's that make it so difficult to settle this war. He has nothing to boast about. The situation for Ukraine is dire. He can have peace or he can fight for another 3 years before losing the whole country. I have nothing to do with Russia, but have much to do with wanting to save, on average, 5,000 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers a week who are dying for no reason whatsoever. The statement made by Zelensky today will do nothing but prolong the killing field, and nobody wants that. We are very close to a deal, but the man with no cards to play should now finally get it done. I look forward to being able to help Ukraine and Russia get out of this complete and total mess that would never have started if I were president.
So that was a reading of President Trump's Truth Social posting, which gives a pretty clear flavour of, I think, what the president was getting across. Not exactly up there with Saturday Night Live for the the precision of the imitation, but I think we absolutely got the point there. Molly, I've got Mikey and Giles with me, but just a word with you. There we have the president, and I know it's familiar, Molly, but he was talking about the inflammatory language of Zelensky being an impediment to progress. He spoke about Zelensky being the man without the cards and therefore being the one who had to try to get this thing done. Message is, it's all about the shortcomings and failings of Zelensky, not at all about Putin.
That's right, and that's been a consistent theme of many, if not all, of the president's comments on this conflict. And, as we reported, the Ukrainians believe that Russia has to make some commitments before they take any position here. They have said that Crimea is a non-starter, but they also are pointing out that the Russians haven't made any commitments to any portion of this at all either. And the president's negotiator Steve Witkoff is scheduled to meet with Putin on Friday. So potentially there could be some movement out of that on that side. But as you note, for the Ukrainians and for people sympathetic to them, they view this sort of one-sidedness of the president's focus on Zelensky as odd, considering that they, see the Russians as the aggressors here and the ones who really need to make any kind of commitment that would end the fighting.
And Molly, before I open it up to Mikey and to Giles, when you hear the vice president J.D. Vance talking about America maybe walking away if progress isn't made, there may be no answer to this at this point. But what do you mean? What do you take walking away to mean?
I think we really don't know, and we've seen the Secretary of State making similar comments, saying this is a take it or leave it point in the negotiations, that a deal has been put on the table and they expect both parties to take it. But I don't think we know, number one, whether that is a true ultimatum or whether they are really prepared to simply abandon this conflict and have nothing more to do with it. or whether that is a negotiating tactic, and what that would actually mean in practice. I think you're right to point out that there's a lot we don't know about just exactly how that might unfold if the U.S. did proclaim that it was walking away from the table.
No, indeed. Mikey and Giles are here. Mikey.
Yeah, Molly, I was just going to ask, sort of following on from that, how is this playing domestically? If Trump were to take the decision not only to pull out of the peace talks, but from the conflict in total, would that reflect badly on him domestically? Would he suffer for that?
I don't know. I would say, on the one hand, Trump's position on Ukraine is not necessarily popular. We have seen that in polls. The vast majority of Americans continue to be supportive of the Ukrainian side in this conflict. And we have not seen a sort of rush to sympathize with the Russians. On the other hand, it simply isn't hasn't been a major point of political debate here. There have been a couple of Republicans who've broken with Trump on Ukraine and have been somewhat critical of him on that basis. But the majority of the political debate in the U.S. at the moment has been much more focused on the tariffs and the potential effects on the U.S. economy of Trump's trade policies, as well as his immigration policies and the continuing controversies over deportations.
Yeah.
So Ukraine simply hasn't been as much a point of political debate here.
Yeah, that is interesting in itself, Giles.
I think one of the things that's interesting on that Truth Social is what he didn't say. And it's been the fact that's been true on day one when this invasion started, this illegal invasion started, is that, he keeps accusing Zelensky of carrying this on and continuing this terrible slaughter. There is one person who could stop it right now, and that's Vladimir Putin, by just withdrawing his troops. And that has been the case throughout. But Molly, one of the things I'm interested in, you say it's a bit of a side issue domestically in the States, and I understand that. Do you think that Trump is basically, what he really wants to concentrate on is what he thinks is going to be a defining issue of some form of confrontation or containment of China, and this is just in the way? That's why he wants it sorted quickly so he can concentrate on that.
That's certainly possible. I don't have any specific reporting to that effect, but it is certainly the case that the administration is also quite focused on China. Any president is going to have multiple foreign policy issues to deal with, and at various points during the campaign, Trump presented the potential for a deal between Ukraine and Russia as a sort of easy thing that he could accomplish with virtually no effort at all. I think we are certainly seeing nearly 100 days in that it at the very least, is not that easy and may not even be possible at all. So whether or not this is something that the administration views as, a sort of minor issue they'd like to clear off their plate and focus on other things, it simply is not the case that it's amenable to that sort of treatment.
Okay, so someone is telling us there is really significant support for Ukraine among the American public. That's certainly the case among the British public, looking at all the opinion polls that we have seen. It seems to be reflected in your thoughts listening to this and your messages writing into the show, for which that's always really grateful to you. This is Paul writing in. He says, great joke. Well, thank you for that, Paul. He says, if the USA does not back Ukraine in defending all its territories, I personally would reject everything associated with the USA going forward, as they do not represent justice and the international order. If you've got another view, if you sympathise wholly with President Trump's take on this, I want to hear from you too, because the criticism and dismissal is pretty thick on the ground right now, certainly among the public, expressed through opinion polls and elsewhere. If you've got another view, we want to hear it. We want to hear and air that point of view as well. So do please text in if that fits your views. Send me a text, 87222, start with the word Times, a tweet to @TimesRadio. Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal is here with us on the programme. So is Giles Dilnot and Mikey Smith, and we are here in association with NatWest Cushion, putting your employees in control of their financial future. Just search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
The day's big stories and tomorrow's front pages. Saturday and Sunday nights from 10 with Daryl Morris.
I'm making a robot head with an Amazon box. I've painted it silver, and Daddy helped me make...
At Amazon, we're actually using paper bags for more of our deliveries.
And now I'm making a paper hot air balloon, and I even made a little brown basket, and I'm making a dog.
Now, we are looking for views that are not entirely critical or dismissive of the take on Ukraine from President Donald Trump and his team. This is in from James. Thank you for writing, James. He says, has anyone asked the people who live in Crimea if they want to be Ukrainian or Russian? I've always considered Crimea to be part of Russia. In the 19th century, we fought the Crimean War against Russia. The Tsar had his summer palace there, and Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin met at Yalta in Crimea. Furthermore, says James, most of the people who live there speak Russian. I think the people who live there deserve to have their say. And Paul writes in. Paul, thank you. He says, do you or your guests have any take on how long it will be before the UK and Europe would be able to support Ukraine to the point where they can win? And I think the answer to that is no, we don't have an answer to that. The scale of that job in the absence of America would be absolutely huge. European allies and friends of Ukraine have, in pretty much every case, an enormous job on their hands building up their own defences as part of NATO in Europe. And that even includes steps taken by countries like Germany to increase their borrowing power absolutely vastly for that purpose. But maintaining this conflict against Russia, even though Russia's forces depleted, no one can quite say what that would involve, Giles.
It was really interesting. When we were going around Europe in 2023 and saying, what have you got in the kitty that you can give to Ukraine? And one of the big things we tried to do was persuade the Germans to release the Leopard 2 tanks. I was talking about letting the cats out of the bag. But the fact of the matter was, lots of people said, yeah, we've got things they could use. Yeah, we've got things they could use. And then it came back and said, actually, it's been in storage for quite a long time. We haven't used it and deployed it, and some of it's not that workable. So there was that. There was also this thing of, well, we can give them things, but obviously we've got to keep some things for ourselves because obviously, you know, for a rainy day. And people kept saying, this is the rainy day. Hand it over. Something's changed. And now we have this business of, you know, you've got to look after the defence of Europe yourself, Europeans. Now that argument for keeping things for a rainy day has just got stronger. So, yes, it's going to get more difficult. It wasn't easy to start with.
All right. Now let's talk tariffs. Earlier on, just have a quick listen back to this. The President speaking to the press, he touched on tariffs.
They all want to be involved with America, and we have a lot of action going on. We're making a lot of money, this country. This country is not going to be losing money on trade anymore. We were losing $2 trillion a year on trade. Now we're going to be making money, a lot of money. So that's very good. Every country wants to partake, even countries that have ripped us off for many, many years. China is an example, but it's not just China. European Union, they ripped us off for many, many years, and those days are over. We're going to make a lot of money for our people. We'll be able to lower taxes substantially, and we're going to be proud of ourselves. They're not going to be a laughing stock that got taken advantage of by virtually every country in the world.
So President Trump there, and a fairly typically bullish view on his tariff policy, you know, as we've certainly come to expect. But equally, the Wall Street Journal now reporting that the Trump team may now be looking at a significant scaling down of those tariffs against China. At the moment, they're of, I lose count, they're over 145%, I think, at the moment. And we're talking, it is reported that the team in the White House are looking at maybe bringing it down to maybe 60%, maybe 50%, still pretty high, but that is a pretty steep decline. Molly Ball at the Wall Street Journal. What are we to make of this, Molly?
I wish I knew. I think everyone in not only Washington, but certainly Wall Street and the global business community wishes that they had some kind of clarity on where all of this is heading. But, you know, we have seen ever since Liberation Day, April 2nd, and even before that, just a continually mixed message on trade policy, whether it's talking about the ultimate goal of the tariffs, what the tariffs are. It seems to change on any given day. We see this continued uncertainty, which I hear from people in the business community has become their sort of principal worry at this point, is that whether or not there are going to be tariffs, a month or 6 months or a year from now, is making it very difficult for them to plan their operations.
Yes.
So, the president has been hearing from a lot of people in American capitalism, and they have mostly been telling him that these tariffs are going to do negative things to the American economy.
Yeah.
And he's clearly hearing some of that and seeking to soften some of the tariffs, but we haven't actually seen movement. We see, him talking about, yes, and we see the Treasury Secretary talking about, yes, this is unsustainable and there's going to have to be some sort of deal. But we don't know what it's going to be, and I think a lot of people, again, with a lot of money, are dying to know exactly where this is all going.
I'm sure that's absolutely true. I wonder if it's going to be chalked down to the influence of Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who is much less hawkish on this matter than some others around the president, Giles.
I think one of the things I would point out is the maths in his rhetoric doesn't add up. I think it's one of your own colleagues, John, Andrew Neil, who did a very good takedown of this idea that the European Union's been ripping him off for years. It just isn't true. I think we have to see them as a negotiating tactic. It's dragging people kicking and screaming to a negotiating start point. I think a lot of people are pointing out that the history of tariffs is not a great one economically to him, and he's being forced to listen to that. But Molly picked up on the most key point. Businesses and economies hate uncertainty. And as long as you have uncertainty, you have economic problems.
Yeah.
So whatever the end goal is, and I don't know any more than Molly does, and possibly some people close to Trump know, is that for as long as you prolong that uncertainty, you will get one result, and that is bad economics.
Well, meanwhile, Mikey, we got our very own Chancellor Rachel Reeves in Washington at that IMF gathering as well, doing whatever she can to try and get a British deal over the line. And that is such a difficult balancing act. First of all, trying to get a deal over the line and deal with the trade-offs that are going to be needed to do that. But at the same time, on the other side of the ocean, the British government is trying to get a EU deal over the line. And some aspects of those two negotiations are in direct contradiction, aren't they?
I think they are, but I think there's a certain amount where that can benefit us. I think Rachel Reeves has gone over there. She spoke to us at the Mirror on Thursday before she went out, and she said to us, yes, we would be willing to walk away from a bad deal. With the shades of Theresa May, almost. No deal is better than a bad deal.
We're really more interested in Europe.
Well, I don't think more interested in Europe, but willing to go to Europe or to move towards Europe if there are red lines that they want to cross and we won't allow. I think every trade deal that's being struck with America is going to be different. I don't think ours is going to be heavily to do with tariffs, because our tariffs on America are relatively low compared to other countries, and our trade with America is fairly balanced. I think it's going to be more things, what they call non-tariff barriers. So it's going to be things like access to markets, access to the NHS, food standards issues, the one we come back to is chlorinated chicken. It's the chicken. It always comes down to chlorinated chicken. But also, J.D. Vance has been making noises about how he wants changes to our hate speech laws in return for a trade deal, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if that comes up as part of the negotiation. Yeah. There's going to be things in the online safety that clash with a lot of the priorities of the Trump administration on what they would call free speech. There's a lot to get through, and I think we don't know exactly what Rachel Reeves's red lines are.
Yeah,
but it seems like she's not in a mad rush, because if all else fails, we just go back to 10% tariffs, and that'll be bad, but not the end of the world if we can open up this massive market that's right next door to us.
So, three quick things. I totally agree with Mikey that I always think of trade deals with America like nuclear fusion. We're always told it's just round the corner and it never quite happens. One of the reasons why the Tories didn't manage to do it, and I think Michael Gove has said this recently, is he said it was me. It was me about agricultural standards and food standards. Well, I think Rachel has said, I don't want to compromise that. That could be a massive problem. I will say this, though. If they pulled it off, that will be a big fillip for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer.
For sure.
Because it's a hell of a thing to get a deal with America. But I still go back to, I think it's like nuclear fusion. I'm sure it's very, very close. I'll believe it when I actually hear it coming in.
And Molly Ball, I mean, just maybe the last word on this from you, Molly, and again, thanks for joining us. Is it going to help the possibility of finding some sort of meeting point when it comes to the UK-US deal? The president sounding very, very bullish, as we hear every time we hear from the president, but there's a certain amount of pressure here on the president. He needs and wants to show some wins. He wants to show something positive for all his efforts, and signing a deal or two, maybe more than two, that might just help him in presentational terms, if little else. That might help Britain, looking at it from that British perspective. Molly.
Potentially. Look, I mean, you're much more well-versed in the finer points of all this than I am. I had never even heard of chlorinated chicken until this moment.
It's all we talk about, yeah, Molly.
So, yes, I'm ready to be educated. But look, I mean, this is one of the things that we're talking about in Washington is just that, 2 weeks ago when these tariffs were paused, you had Trump's advisor, Peter Navarro, saying we're going to have 90 deals in 90 days. We're still waiting to see some of these deals. And while we have heard that, of course, the administration is being deluged with diplomacy from all of these countries, nothing has yet been signed, nothing has yet materialized. So I think the skepticism is warranted.
Okay. It is a very long, drawn-out cliffhanger. Molly, great to get your thoughts here. Let's talk again very soon. You can bet we're going to be inviting you to do exactly that. Mikey, thanks so much for joining us. And to you, Giles, great to have that conversation. Again, let's do it again very soon. Thanks to you for listening. Well, our producer today was Ollie Cole, and our technical operator, the incomparable Isaac Marley. I'm going to be back tomorrow at 4, and Kate Borsay is up next. This is Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
Thanks, John. Have a great night. It's 7 o'clock. This is Kate Borsay with the Evening Edition. Coming up.